There are places on this earth where the ground refuses to keep its secrets quiet, where the sand shifts just enough over the centuries to reveal an outline that should not be there. A curve of bone too long, a skull too heavy, a shape that seems to belong to no story we have ever agreed to tell about ourselves. On the wind-scoured peninsula of Paracas, on the southern coast of Peru, the desert is one of the driest on the planet, a place where rain is a rumour, and the air itself seems to have forgotten how to hold moisture. And it is precisely this dryness, this merciless preservation, that has kept something waiting beneath the surface for the better part of 3,000 years, waiting to be uncovered, waiting, some would say, to be understood. Picture the year 1928. A Peruvian archaeologist named Julio César Tello, a man often called the father of Peruvian archaeology, a scholar of extraordinary drive who had risen from humble Andean roots to command the respect of the international scientific community, is standing over a section of coastal desert known as the Huaricayan Necropolis, near the Chongos Cemetery on the Paracas Peninsula. The sun overhead is relentless. The land is the colour of old bone, and beneath his feet, packed into the dry earth in dense, deliberate clusters, lies one of the most staggering funerary discoveries ever made in the Americas. Over 300 mummy bundles, each one a human being wrapped with immense care in layer upon layer of woven textile, some of the finest and most intricate cloth the ancient world ever produced. These were not careless burials. The people of Paracas, a culture that flourished roughly between 800 BCE and 100 CE, treated their dead with a reverence that borders on the obsessive. The bodies were placed in a seated fetal position, knees drawn to the chest, then bound and wrapped in textiles dyed in colours that still hold their vividness after 2 millennia in the ground. And when Tello and his team began to open these bundles, to peel back the layers of fabric that had protected their contents through the rise and fall of empires, they found the skulls, and the skulls were wrong. Not wrong in the way that damaged or diseased remains are wrong. Wrong in a way that was harder to name. The crania swept backward and upward in long, elegant elongations, rising from the brow in a smooth, uninterrupted arc that carried the back of the head far beyond the boundary of any ordinary human profile. They looked to the untrained eye almost sculptural, as if a hand had reached in and drawn the very bone of the head into a new geometry. There were, by the counts that have followed, specimens with cranial capacities that reached figures that stopped the breath, measurements as high as 2,800 cubic centimetres. Consider that the modern human average sits at roughly 1,350 cubic centimetres. Consider what that gap means, or seems to mean, if the number holds, and hold that number in your mind because it is the number this entire journey will turn upon. Now, before we go any further, we must be honest about what mainstream science says, because the honest telling of any mystery begins with the explanation that seeks to close it. Bioarchaeology, the formal study of human remains, has a name for elongated skulls, and it is not a new name. It is called artificial cranial deformation, or ACD. The practice is well documented across an astonishing range of human cultures, from the Andes to Central Asia to parts of Europe, and it works like this. In the first months of an infant's life, the bones of the skull are soft, pliable, not yet fused, still capable of being coaxed into new shapes. By binding the head between wooden boards or wrapping it tightly with cloth, parents in these cultures could gradually reshape the growing skull into a deliberate form, a marker of beauty, of lineage, of elite status, of belonging to a particular people. The Andean cultures practiced it. This is not disputed. This is history, written in bone across many centuries. And when the mainstream anthropologist looks at the Paracas skulls, this is what they see. A cultural signature, a fashion of the powerful, a message about identity pressed into the very architecture of the head. And here, precisely here, is where the story stops being simple. Because the proponents of the anomalous reading of these skulls are not, contrary to the caricature, merely pointing at a strange shape and calling it strange. They are pointing at something far more specific, far more falsifiable, far more difficult to wave away. They are saying, this is not about shape. This is about volume. This is about mass. This is about the amount of bone. Follow the logic carefully, because it is the hinge of everything. The standard form of cranial deformation practiced by Andean cultures is what anthropologists call biparietal deformation, a flattening produced by pressure applied to the sides or the front and back of the skull. And the crucial point, the point that mainstream science itself affirms, is this: deformation redistributes bone. It does not create it. When you bind an infant's head, you're not adding material, you're moving it. The skull is squeezed in one direction and bulges in another. The total volume enclosed by the cranium remains broadly the same, because you cannot press a shape into a child's head, and in doing so conjure additional bone from nothing. The mass is conserved, the geometry changes, the quantity does not. So the anomalous claim becomes sharp and specific and, most importantly, testable. If certain Paracas skulls possess cranial capacities dramatically exceeding the human norm, not merely a redistributed shape but an enlarged internal volume, then binding boards cannot be the whole answer. You cannot bind a head into being larger, and the proponents go further still. They speak of increased bone density in some specimens, of skulls that weigh more than they should. They speak of crania that appear to possess a single parietal plate, where a human skull possesses two. They speak of the foramen magnum, the great opening at the base of the skull through which the brainstem descends to meet the spine, sitting in a position notably further back than it does in you or in me, a placement that would imply, if genuine, a different distribution of the head's weight, a different centre of gravity, a different way of carrying the skull upon the spine. More bone, not merely reshaped bone. That is the claim. Hold it firmly, because it is the falsifiable heart of this entire inquiry, the single sentence against which everything that follows will be measured. Mainstream science answers, and answers firmly, that cranial deformation is a documented cultural practice that alters shape without creating new bone or increasing brain volume. And that answer is not to be dismissed lightly, for it rests on a vast and solid foundation of established anthropology. And yet the specific measurements, the specific weights, the specific anatomical departures cited by the anomalous camp are not answered simply by naming the practice of binding. To name binding is to explain the shape. It is not, at least not automatically, to explain the volume. So we are left, at the very outset, standing over Tello's opened bundles with a question that has teeth. Were these people simply the recipients of an ancient cosmetic tradition, their heads pressed into fashionable curves by loving hands and unyielding boards? Or does the number, 2,800 cubic centimetres, more than double the human average, point to something the boards can never account for? And if the boards cannot account for it, then what exactly are we looking at? What knowledge, what lineage, what long-buried truth might be waiting inside these silent, elongated witnesses? To press deeper into that question, we must leave the poetry of the desert behind for a moment and enter the cold, exacting language of the anatomist, because it is in the fine forensic detail, in the seams and openings of the bone itself, that the two most troubling features of the Paracas material reveal themselves. These are the features that unsettled the physical anthropologists who first catalogued the collection, and they are the features that will recur, like a haunting refrain, at every site we visit hereafter. Learn them now, carry them with you. The first is the sagittal suture. Run your fingertips across the top of your own head, tracing a line from your forehead back toward the crown. Somewhere along that path, invisible beneath your skin, lies a seam, a fibrous joint where the two parietal bones, the paired plates that form the sides and roof of the skull, meet along the midline. This is the sagittal suture, and it is present in every modern human being. It is not decorative, it is structural, developmental, fundamental to the way the human skull grows. In infancy, the plates are separate, allowing the head to pass through birth and the brain to expand rapidly in the early years. Only later, in adulthood, does the suture fuse and the seam grow quiet. But the seam is always there. It is one of the defining architectural features of the Homo sapiens skull, as reliable as the number of fingers on a hand. And here is what the proponents of the anomalous reading contend: that certain Paracas specimens do not merely have a fused sagittal suture, they lack it entirely, not closed, not sealed over with age, absent, as though the two parietal plates had never been two plates at all, as though the skull had grown from the beginning with a different fundamental configuration of bone. The absence of a suture is not the same as the closure of one. Closure is what age does to a seam that was always present. Absence implies that the seam was never there to close, that the underlying count of bone plates was, from birth, something other than the human standard. Sit with the mechanical weight of that idea. A researcher of the anomalous school, the writer L.M. Marzulli among the most vocal, has argued that this is precisely the situation, that specimens exist in which the sagittal suture is simply not present, implying a bone plate configuration at odds with normal human development. Now, mainstream anatomy offers a counter that must be given its full weight, for it is real and it is documented. Sutures can fuse prematurely, in a condition known broadly as craniosynostosis, and premature fusion can indeed elongate a skull in certain directions. A prematurely closed suture can vanish from view as the surrounding bone grows over it. This is a genuine phenomenon, recognized in clinical medicine and in the archaeological record alike. So the debate does not resolve itself in a single glance. It becomes a contest between two readings of the same silent bone, the reading that says this suture closed early and was overgrown, and the reading that says this suture was never there. And distinguishing between those two possibilities requires more than the naked eye. It requires the tools we will come to later. For now, the anomaly stands, a seam that should be present, and in certain specimens apparently is not. The second feature carries us to the base of the skull, to that great opening we have already named, the foramen magnum. It is, quite literally, the largest natural hole in the human head, the aperture through which the brainstem passes to become the spinal cord, the point at which the head balances upon the vertebral column. Its position matters enormously, because it governs how the weight of the skull is carried. In Homo sapiens, the foramen magnum sits relatively far forward and low, beneath the skull, allowing the head to balance atop an upright spine. A hallmark of our bipedal posture, one of the very traits anthropologists used to distinguish us from our more stooped ancestors and cousins. Where the foramen magnum sits tells you something profound about how a creature held its head, how it stood, how it moved through the world. And in certain Paracas specimens, the proponents claim the foramen magnum sits significantly further back, more posterior and more inferior, shifted toward the rear of the skull's base. If genuine and if unrelated to deformation, such a placement would imply a different balancing point for the head, a different center of gravity, a different mechanical relationship between skull and spine than the one every living human shares. This is the anatomical language you must carry forward. Sagittal suture, foramen magnum, posterior displacement, inferior placement, bone plate configuration. These are not mystical terms. They are the precise vocabulary of the anatomist, and they will let us compare, feature by feature, one site against another as our journey widens across oceans and continents. The mainstream answer, once again, must be stated plainly and respected fully. Intentional cranial deformation, applied with sufficient force and directed pressure, can shift the apparent geometry of the skull's features, including the relative positioning of its openings, and can produce the sweeping elongation seen in the Paracas material without invoking any new lineage of humanity. The scientific consensus attributes these variations to cultural modification, to boards, to cloth, to the patient hands of ancient parents shaping their children toward an ideal. That is the rulebook. That is the well-defended position. And yet the anomalous camp keeps returning to the same stubborn objection. that a redistributed shape and a displaced opening are one thing, but a missing suture and an increased volume are another entirely, and that the rulebook, for all its authority, has never quite closed the file on the volume. How does binding erase a suture that should be present from birth? How does pressure add cubic centimetres of internal space? And why do the very anthropologists who catalogued this material leave, in their notes and their measurements, a faint but persistent trace of unease? These are the questions that travel with us as we leave the Peruvian coast behind and cross an entire world, from the Pacific-facing deserts of South America to a small island in the heart of the Mediterranean, where a different kind of darkness holds a different chapter of the same puzzle. For the strangeness of elongated skulls is not confined to one hemisphere, and the story of how such bones have been handled, displayed, catalogued, and then, in certain cases, quietly withdrawn from the eyes of the public, is its own layered mystery, one that adds institutional shadow to anatomical wonder. Descend now, in your mind, beneath the streets of Paula, near Valletta, on the island of Malta. Here, carved directly into the living rock more than 5,000 years ago, lies the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, a subterranean necropolis of chambers, corridors and burial halls hewn out of the limestone by a Neolithic people whose names we will never know. It was discovered in 1902, stumbled upon during construction, and what emerged from the dark was one of the most remarkable prehistoric structures anywhere on the planet. A 3-story labyrinth descending into the earth, its walls carved with a precision that echoes the architecture of the temples above ground, its chambers holding the scattered remains of an astonishing number of the dead. The air down there is cool and still, thick with the silence of ages, and the acoustics of certain chambers are so peculiar that a low voice can seem to fill the entire space, resonating through the stone in a way that has fed legend for over a century. Between 1903 and 1911, the excavation was led by Sir Themistocles Zammit, a Maltese physician and archaeologist whose careful, methodical work laid the foundation for everything we know about the site. And the numbers he confronted were staggering. The skeletal remains recovered from the Hypogeum have been estimated to represent as many as 7,000 individuals, an entire population of the dead layered into the rock across untold generations. But there was a problem, and Zammit recorded it faithfully. Many of the bones, he noted, were extremely friable, fragile, crumbling, damaged by the damp soil that had seeped through the limestone over the millennia. He wrote that the dampness of the site caused many remains to disintegrate upon contact, dissolving almost at a touch, a factor that has complicated every attempt to inventory the collection from that day to this. Out of that ruin of fragile bone, however, Zammit succeeded in measuring and photographing a smaller set of specimens, 11 skulls in particular, which he described in his 1912 report as being of the long variety, using the formal term dolichocephalic, long-headed. Dolichocephaly, in the strict anatomical sense, simply means a skull that is long from front to back relative to its width, a variation that exists within the ordinary human range and requires no exotic explanation. And the mainstream position on the Hal Saflieni skulls is exactly that. They are long-headed human crania, unremarkable in kind if not in preservation, a natural expression of human variation among a Neolithic island population. That is the sober reading, and it deserves to stand at the front of the room. But the elongated skulls of Malta became something more than a footnote in an excavation report. To certain observers, their extreme long-headedness suggested something beyond the ordinary, a distinct race, a non-Mediterranean people, or, at the outer edge of speculation, an origin not entirely human. And here the mystery shifts its character, because the tension that gathered around these particular bones is no longer only about their anatomy, it is about what happened to them afterward. For decades, several of the elongated skulls were displayed openly at the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, catalogued and visible, appearing in the record of the institution's early years, and, by some accounts, captured in at least one pre-war photograph. Visitors could see them, scholars could examine them, They were part of the accessible story Malta told about its ancient dead. And then, following the museum's closure for refurbishment during the 1980s and into the 1990s, the majority of these specimens were withdrawn from public view. The skulls that had stood behind glass for decades slipped out of the exhibition halls and, critics contend, out of the accessible catalogue as well, leaving behind that most curious of trails, a paper trail of absence. Museum officials state straightforwardly that the bones are stored in the museum's vaults, removed from display for reasons of space, preservation, and the ordinary administrative churn that governs every institution's changing exhibitions. Skeptics note, and note fairly, that the withdrawal of specimens from public display is very often exactly what it appears to be: a preservation measure, a routine reorganization, nothing sinister at all. And yet the pattern lingers uncomfortably in the mind. Anomalous bones, first shown, then unshown, first catalogued, then difficult to trace. This is the second layer of the mystery, laid carefully atop the first. Not merely anomalous morphology, but anomalous handling of that morphology. It is one thing for the earth to hide its strange dead. It is another for the institutions entrusted with those dead to grow quiet around them. In recent years, interdisciplinary efforts such as the project known as the Sentinels of Hal Saflieni have sought to bring modern scientific analysis to bear on the surviving specimens, to resolve at last the long-standing question of whether we are looking at anatomical anomaly or archaeological misinterpretation. But the question that hangs in that cool, resonant dark beneath the streets of Paola is not yet answered. Why were these particular skulls set apart from the thousands around them? What did Zammit truly see when he measured his 11 long-headed specimens? And why, across an ocean and a hemisphere, does the same shape, the sweeping, elongated cranium, keep rising out of the ground to trouble the rulebook we thought we'd finished writing? That last question is not rhetorical embroidery. It is the true doorway into the next stage of this inquiry, because the moment one steps back from any single site, from the sun-baked necropolis of the Pacific coast, from the carved silence beneath Paola, a larger and stranger geography begins to assemble itself. The elongated skull is not a Peruvian phenomenon. It is not a Maltese phenomenon. It appears, again and again, in places that had no contact with one another, separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by thousands of miles of impassable terrain, and thousands of years of unmeasured time. And when a single form recurs across populations that could never have spoken to one another, the mind reaches instinctively for one of two explanations. Either the form arises independently from some shared human impulse, or it points towards something we have not yet named. Both possibilities deserve to be laid on the table, and neither should be seized too quickly. Return then to Peru, but not to Paracas. Move inland and south into the arid valleys around the city of Ica, where a separate provenance holds its own vast collection of elongated crania. It is important to be precise here, because the careless telling of this story tends to fold Ica and Paracas into a single blur, and they are not the same. The Ica specimens come from their own soil, their own burials, their own cultural context, and they arrive in the record as a distinct body of material rather than an extension of Tello's Wari Kayan bundles. Mainstream archaeology reads them in the familiar way, as products of intentional cranial deformation, that widespread Andean practice by which a skull was shaped in infancy, the pliable bone guided by boards and bindings to signify elite status, lineage, or ethnic belonging. Across the Andes, this custom was so common as to be almost unremarkable, a badge worn in the very architecture of the head. That is the sober reading of Ica, and it explains a great deal, yet the reading does not silence every voice. Proponents of the anomalous view point to specimens within the Ica collection, reported to carry cranial volumes as much as 25% larger than those of modern humans, together with an increase in bone density that, they argue, deformation alone should not produce. Binding redistributes bone, it does not in principle manufacture it, and so the same falsifiable claim that shadowed Paracas reappears here in the valleys of Ica, not merely a different shape, but reportedly a different quantity of the material from which the shape is made. Is the increased volume simply the natural consequence of a large-headed individual whose skull was then elongated? Is the reported density an artifact of measurement, of the era in which it was noted, of a sample too small to trust? Or does something in the Ica bone genuinely exceed what the boards and bindings of the Andean nurseries could ever have achieved? The valley keeps its counsel, and the collection waits. Now cross the Great Water, leave the Pacific coast behind and travel to the southern tip of Africa, to the high grasslands of the Transvaal, where in 1913 two farmers digging near the small settlement of Boskop turned up fragments of a human skull that would trouble anthropology for the better part of a century. The specimen was initially described by the South African scientist S. H. Horton, and it was later taken up by the celebrated paleontologist Robert Broom, who examined the brain case and reached a conclusion that few today would dare to publish. He classified it as a distinct species, Homo capensis. The fragments seemed to imply a cranial vault of extraordinary proportion, a brain case dramatically larger than that of any living population in the region, with estimates that range from roughly 1,700 cubic centimetres to as high as 1,980, set against the human average that had already been established in earlier discussion. This was not a marginal difference. It was, if the reconstruction held, a leap. The idea took hold. Early 20th century anthropologists, among them Raymond Dart, the same Dart whose name would become permanently attached to the study of humanity's African origins, entertained the notion of a Boskop race, a vanished people characterized by an enormous brain case perched above a strikingly small, almost childlike face. In the American literature, the specimen passed through the hands of the anatomist Frederick Tilney, and it was described in terms that framed it as a brain of remarkable capacity, a mind housed in a vault beyond ordinary scale. For a time, the Boskop skull carried a genuine aura of the uncanny within respectable science. The suggestion, whispered and then repeated, that somewhere in the deep past there had walked a people better endowed, cranially, than ourselves. It was the kind of claim that sets the imagination alight, and it was made not by fringe pamphleteers but by working anatomists in the pages of formal publication. And here is where the pattern of this entire story shows its second face, the face of correction. By the late 1950s, researchers began to dismantle the Boskop race from the inside. The anthropologist Ronald Singer, among others, revisited the material and reclassified it, arguing that these were not the relics of some separate large-brained species, but morphological variations within populations ancestral to the living Khoisan peoples of southern Africa. The extraordinary capacity on this reading was an artifact of method, of reconstructing a whole vault from fragments, of the racialized craniometry that saturated the science of the early century, of small sample sizes stretched to bear grand conclusions. The category Boskopoid was quietly retired. Today it is regarded in mainstream terms as an obsolete taxonomic artifact, a ghost of an older and more credulous anthropology. That is the honest state of the question, and it must be stated plainly. Yet even here the pattern insists on being noticed. Consider what actually happened across those decades. A specimen was found, its anatomy was declared anomalous by serious scientists, a new category was erected to contain it, and then, as the field matured, the anomaly was reabsorbed into the standard human range and the category dissolved. Anchor that sequence in the mind, because it is the very rhythm we've been tracing. Discovery, formal puzzlement, reclassification, absorption. Was Boskop simply an early error properly corrected, a triumph of scientific self-scrutiny over the biases of its founders? Almost certainly, in large measure, yes. But one may still ask whether the correction was purely a matter of better data, or whether it was also a matter of a discipline growing uncomfortable with the shape of its own findings. When does a reclassification cleanse the record, and when does it merely tidy away the thing that would not fit? Follow the pattern once more, this time far to the north and east, into the steppes and highlands of the North Caucasus, where the burial mounds the Russians call kurgans rise from the grasslands like the backs of half-buried beasts. During the long decades of Soviet-era excavation, archaeologists opening these mounds across the North Caucasus and the wider Black Sea region unearthed, with striking frequency, elongated crania, the same sweeping vault, the same backward-drawn skull, now set among the grave goods of the mounted nomads who ruled these plains. The specimens are often associated with the Sarmatian and Alanic cultures, the horse peoples whose elites moved across the steppe in the first centuries of our era, and in the formal literature they were documented as exactly what the context suggested: elite burials, the graves of the powerful. The mainstream explanation here is perhaps the most straightforward of all, because the cultural mechanism is so well attested. Russian archaeologists, among them researchers such as Yuri Makurov, identify the elongated skulls of the Kurgans as products of artificial deformation practiced by the nomadic steppe aristocracy, a custom by which the ruling class quite literally marked its children's heads as different from the common run. The elongated skull on this reading was a crown grown into the bone, a permanent and unmistakable sign of rank among peoples who prized visible distinction. When later and more sensational voices attached the word alien to these Caucasus finds, the archaeologist answered with the ethnography: this is deformation, deliberate and cultural, common among the elites of the steppe. And that answer carries real weight, for the practice is documented, its purpose understood, its distribution mapped. But now stand back and look at what the map itself is telling us. The elite of the Andean coast bound the heads of their children. The Neolithic islanders of Malta, or so the sober reading holds, produced long-headed individuals of their own. The horse lords of the Caucasus shaped the skulls of their young to mark them as rulers. Southern Africa yielded at least once a vault so large that serious scientists briefly built a species around it. 4 regions, unconnected by any known thread of contact, separated by oceans and mountains and millennia, and in each of them the same fundamental gesture toward the elongated cranium, whether by binding, by nature, or by something not yet accounted for. This is the heart of the matter, and it is genuinely two-edged. On one edge lies the mundane explanation, and it is a powerful one. Cranial modification was a global, multi-millennial human practice, arising again and again wherever a people wished to mark themselves apart, so that its recurrence proves nothing more exotic than the universality of human vanity and belonging. On the other edge lies the question that will not quite lie down: why this shape? Of all the ways a body might be modified, why does the elongated head recur across peoples who never met? Is it convergence upon an ideal of beauty or power that the human mind reaches for independently? Or is it, as the anomalists insist on asking, an echo of something older and shared, a memory of a form that once existed and was afterward imitated? The anthropologists who first confronted these specimens did not have the luxury of the answers we now inherit. In the early literature, formal puzzlement was common and openly expressed, the puzzlement of men working with limited sample sizes, within the racialized craniometry of their age, looking at bones that seem to strain the boundaries of the known. Names surface in this record and deserve to be spoken. Drennan, whose anatomical studies in southern Africa grappled with the material. Galloway, who worked over the same terrain of measurement and classification. And the others whose careful, cautious bewilderment fills the margins of the early reports before the tide of reclassification carried the anomalies back into the standard taxonomy. They were not credulous men. They were trained observers who wrote down that they did not entirely understand what they were seeing. And the honest historian of this subject must hold 2 things at once: that their puzzlement was largely a product of an immature science, and that puzzlement, honestly recorded, is itself a kind of data. What did they see before the categories tightened around it? If the bones themselves have proved ambiguous, there was always the hope that a newer instrument might cut through the ambiguity, that the molecule might say what the measurement could not. And so, in the years spanning roughly 2014 to 2018, the Paracas story entered a new and far more contested phase, driven by the researcher Brian Furster, who who has long maintained that the elongated crania of Peru's Pisco province, the very skulls first drawn from the earth by Julio Tello in 1928, represent something other than an ordinary human lineage. Forster pursued the question through DNA, reporting preliminary findings often associated with the geneticist Melba Ketchum, working under a research banner that carried the Paracas name. The samples were hair and tooth taken from the ancient remains, and the claims that emerged from them were extraordinary in the most literal sense. Set them out precisely, because precision is the only honest way through a swamp like this one. The reports claimed that mitochondrial DNA extracted from the samples contained mutations described as unknown in any human, primate or animal known so far, a phrasing that, if it meant what it said, would place the Paracas individuals outside the entire catalogued tree of life. Later iterations softened and shifted the claim. The anomalous markers, it was now suggested, pointed not to some wholly unknown creature, but toward populations of the Near East or Eastern Europe, specifically the regions of the Black Sea and the Caspian, a haplogroup signal, in other words, that did not sit cleanly among the recognized founding lineages of the Native American peoples, and instead seemed to gesture across the world toward the very steps where the Kurgans hold their elongated dead. It is difficult to overstate how electric such a result would be if it held. A migratory thread linking the coast of Peru to the shores of the Caspian would rewrite chapters of human prehistory that are currently considered settled. But whether it holds is exactly the question, and the methodological ground beneath these claims is treacherous. Mainstream science has met them with firm and reasoned opposition, and the reasons are not dismissals but specifics. There is the matter of chain of custody, the unbroken documented record of who handled a sample, when and under what conditions, which in rigorous ancient DNA work is treated as sacred, and which around these results is difficult to establish. There is the absence of peer-reviewed publication, so that the findings circulated through videos and presentations rather than through the adversarial gauntlet of formal review. And above all, there is the ever-present spectre of contamination. Ancient DNA is fragile, degraded, and vanishingly scarce within a sample, while modern DNA, from every hand that has touched the bone, every breath that has passed over it across a century of handling, is abundant and aggressive. In a specimen processed outside a certified ancient DNA facility, the risk that one is reading the genome of a recent handler rather than an ancient individual is not a quibble. It is the central hazard of the entire discipline, and so the crucial fact must be stated without flinching. No independent certified laboratory has replicated the anomalous haplogroup findings on properly documented Paracas specimens. The great ancient DNA laboratories, including the work carried out under the exacting standards of the Reich Lab at Harvard, one of the world's foremost centers for the recovery of ancient genomes, have not confirmed a lineage that falls outside the known human tree. One pointed critic likened the whole affair to what he called Melba Ketchum's earlier Bigfoot debacle, arguing that the release of unverifiable data served to feed fringe theories rather than to advance the archaeological record. That is a stinging judgment, and it may well be the correct one. Yet notice what is required of us here, and notice how uncomfortable it is. We are asked to hold a result that is real in the sense that it was reported, and contested in the sense that it cannot be trusted, and unresolved in the sense that it has been neither replicated nor conclusively buried. The responsible position is not to seize the claim as vindication, nor to wave it away as fraud, but to leave the file open at the precise point where the evidence leaves it. The DNA window opened. Through it, for a moment, something strange seemed to glimmer, and then the window partly closed, not because the strange thing was proven absent, but because the means of proving anything at all had not been met. What would a clean sample, taken under full chain of custody and run in a certified lab, actually show? Until that test is done and published, the honest answer is that we do not know. There is, however, one further thread in this story that does not depend on molecules at all, a thread that runs not through the laboratory, but through the ledger, the accession book, the quiet administrative machinery by which institutions decide what the public may and may not see. For alongside the disputed anatomy and the disputed DNA, there is the plainer, colder question of the record itself, and here the pattern grows harder to explain away. Consider what has been reported to happen to the specimens once they pass out of the ground and into the keeping of museums. Accession numbers that once resolved to a physical object no longer resolve in the digital catalogues. Specimens described in detail in the literature of the years before 1950 do not appear on the current holdings lists of the institutions that once housed them, and the case of the Museo Regional de Ica sits at the centre of this concern, for local researchers, among them Renato Davila Riquelme, have reported inconsistencies between the legacy inventory records and the current public holdings, noting that specific specimens documented in the studies of the mid-20th century are no longer locatable or accessible to those who go looking for them. Before any darker reading is entertained, the legitimate framework must be set squarely in place, for there is a formal name and a formal justification for the removal of objects from a collection. The practice is called deaccessioning, the regulated permanent removal of an item from an institution's holdings, undertaken for a whole range of entirely ordinary reasons. Museums deaccession to manage redundancy, to dispose of hazardous materials, to shed objects that fall outside their mission, to free the perpetual burden of storage. In the specific case of human remains, the modern era has brought powerful and morally serious reasons for removal from display. Institutions such as the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford and the American Museum of Natural History in New York have, in recent years, taken human remains out of public view precisely to confront the colonial legacies of their collecting and to make possible the repatriation of the dead to their descendant communities. These are not conspiracies. They are in many cases acts of overdue conscience. And yet the argument advanced by the researchers who track these vanishings is not that removals happen. Of course they happen, but that the removals cluster. If deaccessioning and withdrawal were operating as routine curation, one would expect the losses to be scattered more or less randomly across a collection, falling upon the mundane and the anomalous alike in rough proportion to their numbers. What is contended here is that the pattern departs sharply from that expectation, that the disappearances gather with disproportionate weight around exactly those specimens with the most anomalous morphology, the skulls with reported fused sutures, the crania with non-standard placement of the foramen magnum, the very bones that most stubbornly resist conventional anatomical classification. It is one thing for a collection to shed its redundancies. It is another for the shedding to fall again and again upon the precise objects that most trouble the accepted account. As one careful observer put it, these are unresolved coincidences, cases that warrant transparent re-examination rather than quiet dismissal. Are we watching the ordinary attrition of overcrowded vaults, indifferent to the shape of what it removes? Or is there, running beneath the paperwork, a faint and unacknowledged preference for the disappearance of the inconvenient, a tendency, never announced and perhaps never even conscious, for the strangest bones to be the ones that slip most easily out of reach? These are the questions that hang in the air once the paperwork has been laid open, and they are questions to which no clean answer has been returned. But fairness demands that we now turn the lens the other way, that we set aside the shadows of the accession book for a moment and give the conventional account its full and unhurried hearing. Not the caricature of it, not the straw man erected by those who prefer their mysteries unchallenged, but the strongest, most rigorous version of the mainstream case, stated as its own most careful advocates would state it. For the discipline of physical anthropology has not been silent on these skulls. It has been, in fact, remarkably clear. The case begins with a single, well-established fact about the human body. The infant skull is not a finished thing. It is soft, unfused, still in the process of becoming, its plates of bone floating in a scaffold of cartilage and membrane, held together by seams that will not knit shut for years. This plasticity is not speculation. It is the daily observation of every pediatrician and every anatomist who has ever handled the cranium of a newborn. And into this window of malleability, cultures across the world reached with deliberate hands. The practice has a formal name: intentional cranial modification or intentional cranial deformation, and it is one of the most widely documented body modification traditions in the whole of the human record. From the Andes to the steppes of Central Asia, from the Pacific Islands to the plains of North America, people separated by oceans and by millennia arrived independently at the same idea: that the shape of the head could be altered in infancy, bound with boards or wrapped tightly with cloth, coaxed over months and years into a form that marked the bearer as belonging to a particular family, a particular rank, a particular people. The chief living authority on the Paracas material in this vein is John Verano of Tulane University, a physical anthropologist who has published extensively on the bioarchaeology of ancient Peru, and whose reading of these crania is neither dismissive nor evasive but grounded in decades of hands-on study. In his account, the elongated skulls of Paracas are precisely what they appear to be to the trained eye. The products of cradle boarding and head binding begun in the first weeks of life, when the plates could still be persuaded, and continued through the years when the growing brain pressed outward against a mould that redirected its expansion. The head is not lengthened by the addition of anything. It is lengthened by the redistribution of what is already there, the frontal bone reclining, the parietals rising and stretching backward, the whole vault flowing into the ovoid or the cone that the binders intended. And what of the sutures, those seams whose reported absence or fusion has been offered as the hardest evidence that these are no ordinary skulls? Here too the mainstream account has a ready and coherent reply, and it deserves to be heard at full weight. The pressure of prolonged binding, applied precisely to the regions where the plates meet, can itself obscure the appearance of a suture, can accelerate its fusion, can flatten and blur the line where two bones join, until, to a casual inspection, the seam seems simply to have vanished. What looks like an absent sagittal suture may be a suture that fused early under mechanical stress, or a suture whose surface has been so remodelled by years of pressure that it no longer reads as a normal seam. And beyond the effects of binding, there is the plain fact of human variation. The timing of suture closure is not fixed across all people. It is a trait that varies from population to population, an inherited rhythm that runs early in some lineages and late in others. A population-level genetic variant in the timing of fusion is not an exotic hypothesis. It is ordinary biology, the kind of quiet difference that distinguishes one ancestral group from another without ever crossing into the anomalous. In this reading, the fused sutures of Paracas are not the fingerprint of an unknown species, but the ordinary signature of a specific people, shaped by both their genes and their cradles. This is a strong case. It is important to say so plainly. It rests on established anatomy, on a globally attested cultural practice, on decades of careful fieldwork, and on the sober recognition, as Verano and others have long emphasized in broader bioarchaeological contexts, that the human skull is among the most plastic structures in the body, capable of astonishing transformation under sustained and patient pressure. Confronted with this account, the honest observer must concede that a great deal of what has been presented across these sites as impossible is, in fact, entirely possible, and that the burden of extraordinary claims rests, as it always must, upon those who make them. And yet, and it is here that fairness, having done its full work, produces not comfort but unease, the mainstream account, for all its rigour, runs out of explanatory bandwidth at three specific and stubborn points, and it is worth marking each of them with precision, because the strength of the conventional case makes the gaps that remain more troubling, not less. The first gap is the one that has haunted this inquiry from its opening: volume. Binding redistributes bone. It does not manufacture it. The physics of the practice is a physics of reshaping, of pushing the same quantity of skull into a different outline, and no amount of pressure applied to an infant's head can conjure additional cranial capacity into being where none was present to begin with. This is not a fringe objection. It is a straightforward consequence of the very mechanism the mainstream itself invokes. If the binders merely redirected the growth of a normal brain into an elongated vault, then the interior volume of that vault should fall within the normal human range, however dramatic its outward shape. And here the reports diverge sharply from expectation. The claim advanced by the observers who have measured these crania is not primarily about their length, but about their capacity, about interior volumes and bone masses that, in some specimens, are said to exceed the standard human range by as much as 25%. Cradleboarding, whatever its power over shape, offers no account of a quarter more room inside the skull. The conventional explanation addresses the outline and falls silent before the volume, and that silence is precisely the width of the anomaly. The second gap is one of evidence never gathered. For all the historical fascination with the Boskop material, the skull raised from the Transvaal soil in 1913, the classification and reclassification that followed, the Boskop race entertained and then quietly retired, and for all the puzzlement provoked by the elongated crania of the Caucasus Kurgans, there exists to this day no certified peer-reviewed ancient DNA study that would settle the biological classification of either. The molecular tools that could speak to the question have been trained, in the modern era, on countless ancient populations across the globe. The great sequencing laboratories have reconstructed the genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and long-vanished migrations from fragments far more degraded than a well-preserved cranium. And yet these particular specimens, the ones that most provoked the anatomists of an earlier century, have not been subjected to that scrutiny in any form that the discipline would accept as definitive. The mainstream is entirely within its rights to say that no anomaly has been proven. It is harder for it to say why the test that could prove or dissolve the anomaly has not been run. The third gap is the one that does not concern bone at all, but paper. The Halsaflieni skulls, the dolichocephalic crania described in the report of 1912, displayed for decades in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, and withdrawn from public view in the wake of the refurbishment that followed, have never been accompanied in their withdrawal by the kind of transparent documentation that would lay the matter to rest. The institutional response has been to state, reasonably enough, that the skulls were never as anomalous as the popular narratives have claimed, and that their removal reflects ordinary considerations of storage and preservation rather than any suppression. That may well be the whole of the truth. But the catalogue gap itself, the distance between what the pre-war literature describes and what the current public record makes available, has never been formally closed, and the absence of that closure is not a matter of interpretation. It is a fact about the record, and it sits there, unresolved, inviting exactly the speculation the institution would prefer to dispel. Set these three gaps side by side and a shape emerges from them. Not a proof, not a verdict, but a shape. The mainstream account is powerful precisely where the anomalies are weakest, and quiet precisely where they are loudest. It explains the elongation and cannot explain the volume. It rests on decades of study and has never commissioned the one study that would decide the matter. It offers a wholly plausible reason for the Malta withdrawal and has never produced the audit that would confirm it. The persistence of these specific recurring features across sites that shared no culture, no trade route, no common ancestry within any period that would join them, the fused seams, the displaced foramen magnum, the excess capacity, remains a point of contention that the discipline, for all its authority, has yet to reconcile with the public record. The strongest version of the ordinary explanation, honestly stated, does not dissolve the mystery, it narrows it. And a mystery narrowed to its hardest core is a more difficult thing to live with than a mystery left comfortably vague. So we return, as every long inquiry must return, to where it began, to the pale ground of the Chongos Cemetery on the Paracas Peninsula, at the hour when the desert light goes long and low, and the sand takes on the colour of old bone. The wind that crosses this necropolis has crossed it for 3,000 years, indifferent to the arguments it carries away. Somewhere beneath this earth, Julio Cesar Tello worked in 1928, lifting the mummy bundles from the sand of the Wari Kayan, folding back the fine textiles from the seated dead, and it was here that the first of these skulls came up into the light and began the long argument that has not yet ended. Standing at this place as the sun lowers, one feels the peculiar weight of a question that has outlasted the men who first asked it. The sense that the land itself has kept its counsel, that the bones have said what they will say and are waiting, with the terrible patience of the buried, for the living to decide what to do with it. What then has actually been established when the speculation is stripped away and only the documented remains? 4 things, and they must be stated exactly, without inflation and without diminishment, for they are the whole of the honest inheritance of this inquiry. The morphological anomalies are real and documented. The elongation, the reported volumes and weights, the non-standard placement of the foramen magnum, the disputed sutures, whatever their cause, they exist in the literature and in the specimens, and no one serious denies the observations, only their interpretation. The institutional handling has been irregular and documented. The withdrawal of the Malta skulls from display in the 1980s, the reported inconsistencies between the legacy inventories and the current holdings at ICA, the accession numbers that no longer resolve, these too are matters of record, not of rumour. The DNA evidence is preliminary and contested, the early non-peer-reviewed reports of unknown genetic markers, followed by the subsequent forensic analyses, the short tandem repeat typing, and the Raman spectroscopy, which have consistently identified these remains as human. The molecular window opened and returned an answer that satisfied no one entirely, and the definitive study has not been done. And the cross-site pattern is real and unexplained. Elongated crania appearing in cultures as scattered as the Paracas of coastal Peru, the Boskop of southern Africa, the Sarmatian and Alanic elites of the Caucasus, joined by nothing but the shape of what came out of their graves. These 4 things are the file, and the file remains open. It would be a betrayal of everything this inquiry has tried to be to close it now with a flourish, to pronounce a verdict that the evidence has not earned. There is no lost race here that the record can confirm, and no ordinary explanation that the record can complete. What there is instead is a set of specific, nameable studies that have not been done, and the naming of them is the most useful thing that can be offered in place of a false certainty. There should be a multi-lab ancient DNA consortium study, conducted on certified Paracas and Boskop specimens under strict chain of custody protocols, with independent extraction and sequencing across several laboratories, and full publication of the results whatever they show. Such a study would end the DNA argument in the only way it can honestly be ended, by replacing contested single-source claims with replicated transparent data. It has not been done. There should be a formal audit of the Halsaflieni catalogue, checking the current holdings item by item against the pre-war records and the report of 1912, so that the distance between what was described and what remains can be measured precisely and either explained or acknowledged. Such an audit would close the catalogue gap or reveal its true dimensions. It has not been done. And there should be a rigorous biomechanical modelling study, a physical and computational test of whether cradle boarding, applied with the force and duration attested in the ethnographic record, can produce not merely the elongated shape, but the reported increase in interior volume. Such a study would speak directly to the hardest anomaly of all, the one the mainstream explanation cannot presently reach. It has not been done. And this is the fact that belongs in the record above all the others, the fact that no interpretation can soften and no institution has yet answered. The reason these studies have not been done is itself a datum. It is not neutral that the tests capable of resolving a decades-old question remain uncommissioned, while the question itself continues to draw the attention of the public and the puzzlement of anatomists. The absence of transparent research is not the same as the absence of a mystery. It is, if anything, a component of it, a persistent gap between popular inquiry, which has never stopped asking, and institutional research, which has never quite chosen to answer. When the means to settle a matter exist and the matter goes unsettled, the not settling becomes part of the story that must be told. So the skulls remain where they have always been, in the vaults, in the disputed catalogues, in the dry ground of the Chongo cemetery, under a sky that has watched them for 3,000 years. They are almost certainly human. The forensic work says so, and there is no honest reason to pretend otherwise. But being human has never made a thing ordinary, and it has never made a question closed. The elongated dead of Paracas and Malta, and the Transvaal and the Caucasus, keep their silence still, holding whatever they hold within the pale curve of their impossible vaults, waiting for a curiosity patient enough and honest enough to ask them properly, with certified samples and open catalogues and published data, rather than with either credulity or contempt. Until that day comes, the file stays open, and the wind keeps crossing the necropolis, and the strangest bones we've ever pulled from the earth go on refusing quietly and completely to tell us what they are.